Good evening, everyone. So what I plan to do over the next couple of hours, and thank you everyone for kindly joining on a Saturday evening, is that I'm going to capture some of the general concepts under the non-debt instrument rules. We will also then pick up the different forms of investment routes available for corporate entities, and so far as corporate entity investments and corporate investments really are concerned. Plus, we will go over a few real life examples and situations we face. So what I've tried over in each of these areas. And lastly, we will end with a few very recent revisions to these rules and what is the probable and the possible impact and how this is really going to be advantageous or otherwise to the entire process under the non-debt instrument rules and the approval process that is prescribed by the FEMA. So to start with, I have actually just picked up a few basic concepts, really, and which, as such, are just giving an overview in terms of who's a person that's going to be a resident in India or otherwise, and also what is the entire framework that one needs to review when one is advising or one is considering a situation of a foreign direct investment into India. The entire framework is encompassed in the FEMA Act, which is the primary act which gives all the powers. Now the NDI rules, that is the non-debt instrument rules, so far as the equity instruments and non-debt instruments are concerned. FDI policy, which is a legacy document, but it continues to subsist. And subsequently, we have the press notes that are issued by the DPIIT, which used to be the DIPP and used to function along with FIPB earlier. One question that always comes in our mind is that what is binding? How does one look at the binding value of which document does one rely if there is an inconsistency? And what is the rationale behind the change in the power control that has happened recently in October 2019? And why the non-debt instrument rules have overtaken the FEMA 20 of 2000 as we knew it classically, which was something that we would always rely on, ever since the FEMA initially prescribed the foreign investment regulations. So one more thing that I would like to add, always used to be a part of that regime, was master directions and master circulars. So what is really what is really binding, and what is it that is law? So really speaking, the FDI policy also clearly says that the press notes or the policy is something that indicates the policy decision, but it becomes law only once it is notified as a notification or as a gazette. And today it becomes law only when it is covered as part of the NDI rules or as an amendment to the NDI rules. We'll just sort of see how the whole position regarding master directions is concerned, because that also I mentioned. So I think for the first slide, the clear position is that the notification or rules is what the law is, while initially we always see a press note that comes through, but it takes effect only when it's published in the Gazette, and it becomes law only when it is published in the Gazette. The change in position prior to October and post-October is that initially the government always came up with the policy and the press notes. RBI, on the other hand, always issued their notifications, and we know for a fact that FEMA 20 of 2000, as we used to refer it to, used to be the base regulations which laid down the entire mechanism for foreign direct investment, deferred consideration, all the other provisions, etc., so far as investments into India into non-debt instruments was concerned. After the October, the amendments to the Finance Act of 2015 were made effective, and the power to make rules so far as equity instruments is concerned, so far as investments under the non-debt instruments is concerned, was shifted to the central government. And the central government took over the right to create the rules as well as the policy. So the worry of the inconsistency became much lesser, Because what used to happen earlier is that the government would prescribe a position, then RBI would have a certain different view, and that RBI's view would continue to be challenged or discussed between them, and there would be inconsistencies, and we would have questions around which would work and which would not work. But after the position has changed, we've seen very quickly. So I will deal it in more detail, but we've seen the press note 3 of 2020, for example, which put restrictions on investment from bordering nations. We saw that within 5 days, the notification also came through, because it's the same authority who was making everything and making all the rules, regulations, etc. now, which is the central government. Obviously, they're consulting with the RBI as well. However, what about master directions? So I'm seeing and I'm dealing with this question on many occasions, that what about master directions and how does that really function? So master directions were issued for the purposes of ensuring compliance with the FEMA 20R. So this was issued really under FEMA with the view that direct authorized dealers and others can ensure compliance with FEMA 20 of 2000. Because FEMA 20 of 2000 was superseded by the NDI rules, in my view, clearly there is no question of relying on master direction, but I've seen a few practical instances where people have relied, because there are certain aspects which are not very clear still in the NDI rules, which I will also capture as we move forward. So today, as we speak, master direction does not hold good. There have been some recent amendments which will now lead to another set of master directions coming through from RBI, because they have been again granted some powers to issue directions or do some administrative action so far as the rule is concerned. So I don't know. So to that extent, one has to look at this this aspect now, that as of today, master directions are not valid. But going forward, once they issue the new set under the NDI rules, it will become again of the same value that we used to attribute it to. Now, moving forward, there are few things I thought as basic concepts, we'll very quickly run over it. What are the types of instruments? One of them is equity shares. We know that. Preference shares, again, which are convertible fully, which is treated at par with equity. Then we have share warrants. And then we have non-convertible, redeemable preference shares. And we have compulsorily and fully convertible instruments. So the point really is that unless the instruments are fully convertible, they don't have the character of equity, and they could be looked at as debt. So the usual scenario, except for non-convertible redeemable preference shares as a scheme and issued out of reserves, every time we are dealing with any instrument to be issued to a foreign investor, it has to be fully convertible and compulsorily convertible without any optionality attached, because the moment optionality comes through, that becomes a problem, and it's governed by the external commercial borrowing and the debt regulations really, and not by these regulations. It's not considered part of the foreign direct investment bucket. Just to share a background, until 2007, the position was different, and therefore there is some amount of grandfathering that's done, but that's a long time ago. So any new instrument that one is issuing to a foreigner, whether it is a convertible, whether it is in form of a convertible debenture or preference share, has to be fully and compulsorily convertible. Now, I mentioned that there is some inconsistencies today in between the NDI rules and what the regime used to be. And I don't know if it's intentional or otherwise. Therefore, people do rely on master directions practically, though I don't fully agree with that approach. So one example of that is partly paid up shares. Today, the NDI rules allows you to issue partly paid up shares, but with the condition that you make it fully paid up within 12 months of such issue. And it says, or as may be specified by the Reserve Bank of India. Today, after the October rules came into force, there is no specification or any notification from RBI's end as to what is that additional period that one can avail and what are the conditionalities. However, the earlier set of master directions used to mention that you could extend that up to 18 months or extend it further, but you have to have a monitoring agency in place who will monitor how the whole functioning is working, etc. My view, because today the NDI rules don't say that, one cannot rely on any of those earlier notifications unless a new notification comes through. But I have seen in the market and even during transactions, some other advisors or clients have taken a position that we will rely on the master direction so far as the mechanism on an extended period is concerned. But for the reasons we discussed in the very beginning, master direction is for a specific purpose, and that purpose is not met because FEMA 20 is no longer there. So that is why now we will be very soon seeing a new set of such notifications. But until then, there is 12-month period that would apply to any partly paid up instrument. Then we have convertible instruments. When these rules came into force, there was some amount of confusion on how the conversion price and formula will work. So one issue that we always discuss and which is of interest is that whenever you issue any convertible, what is the timing for determining the price? So I will give you a very simple example and we'll deal with it that way. First example really is that if I am issuing an instrument which is a convertible which entitles someone to 2 equity shares, and on that date of my issue, if the fair value of the equity share is 100 rupees each, then the value of that convertible will be 200. So what I'm trying to say is that the relevant date for determining the pricing will be the very date on which you have issued the instrument and not the date when it will convert. For example, you have issued the instrument today, and and it is convertible in the next year. Obviously, by next year, hopefully, all this COVID situation changes completely. It becomes historical. And, there are usual vaccines prescribed. Everyone is taking annual vaccines and there is no problem whatsoever. And markets and businesses are doing as normal or even better than they used to do. The price of the shares which were 100 on the date of issue today is now 300. Now, what does one do? Can one then say that I want to now increase the price? Can one then say that you're a foreigner, you cannot purchase it at a lower than the fair market value? You have to pay me 300. What does one do? The situation is that because you have upfront fixed the price, your conversion will still work as per your upfront price. However, should you decide commercially to change anything, you will have to approach the RBI. Because RBI takes into record this FDI inflow at a certain price when you do the filing and the reporting with the RBI. So I think there was lack of clarity on what will be the different timings, and that was set clear in the December clarification that it is actually the price that you at the date of issuance and you don't need to relook at that price or revisit that price. Again, so far as rights issue is concerned and bonus issue is concerned, a company is allowed to do that and it is all attributed to your earlier holding in the company. One interesting aspect I want to point out is that as far as rights issue is concerned, the clear provision is that whatever price clear provision in the NDI rules mentions that whatever price you offer to a resident, you should offer the same price to a non-resident. So there is no real pricing guideline, so to say, for rights issue for obvious reasons that, rights issue is given to the existing shareholders. And the idea really is to ensure that the existing shareholders are attracted to further invest in the company, and therefore it is usually given at a discount. Now, what used to happen is people have misused this to get new foreign investors at a lower price, and I'll tell you how that would have worked. What would really work is that in a renunciation situation, one would launch a rights issue, and then you get the existing shareholders to renounce that in favor of another non-resident who may not be a shareholder at all. And that non-resident would come into the company at such lower price that was offered to the renouncee, to the renouncer, the one who was renouncing itself, and would take advantage of investing in the Indian company at a lower price. To deal with that, there is 2 specific positions that are now done, and this amendment was recent amendment, as amongst the multiple amendments that were undertaken with a view to protect Indian companies' value and investment from foreigners, and also sort of, deal with how opportunistic investors have to be subject to conditionalities, both from pricing and otherwise. And we'll deal with a few more examples as well. Here, what happens is now in an unlisted company, if you're renouncing your shares in favor of another party who's a non-resident, such renouncee who receives the renunciation right will no longer get the advantage of the price the lower price or the price of the rights issue, and will have to comply with pricing guidelines. There is a twofold impact of this amendment. For unlisted companies, clear impact, because your unlisted company pricing is as per the internationally acceptable pricing guidelines. One will have to look at multiple methods, whatever works best in their business, whether it's DCF or otherwise, what is the book value, what is the other values, everything has to be considered. And then your price may be much higher usually, because that is usually at a discount from the usual fair market value. What about listed companies? Now, listed companies pricing guidelines says that whatever the SEBI prescribed pricing guidelines is, should be the pricing guidelines. Now, for SEBI prescribed pricing guidelines, for rights issue, one has to look at the ICDR, and the ICDR allows the company to determine the price. So really, so far as listed companies is concerned, no impact, because in any event, the pricing guidelines, so to say, is linked to SEBI. So therefore, and also one would say that really speaking, why the regulation has not been so very categorical so far as listed company is concerned, because structuring an entry for a foreigner at a lower price in a listco will not work, because there is a very large base of shareholders. There is a corporate governance which is in multiples of what would be in an unlisted company. And one cannot structure this, because this goes to all the public shareholders and everybody. So that would be, it would always be a genuine transaction. It would never be something which would be unusual entry for a foreigner or a non-resident at a lower price. So a listed company is no real impact. So that's something I thought I should capture. Now I thought I'll take a break and walk over this case study, but I think we will do it a little later. You all can have a look at the questions, but we'll do it a little later when we discuss the recent developments, towards the end of the session. Is that okay? Can I proceed?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now the next aspect is, how does gift of shares really work? And I want to share one example also in this situation. So we should look at carefully, how this whole thing is working. So from non-resident to non-resident, there is no problem. One can gift always. From a non-resident to resident, it is again permitted, no problem. A resident holding on non-repatriation basis to a non-resident, you require a prior approval. So when we say resident on non-repatriation basis, one will say, what is this meaning? How will a resident hold on? What is the whole non-repatriation link? So the link is, if it's an NRI, this would really, be the situation where you are a resident holding on a non-repatriation basis. Again, an NRI to NR, again, if it's non-repatriation basis, you will need a prior RBI approval. NRI to NRI, it is permitted. So we have seen one situation, and I'll just leave you all with the thought. The situation was that we had a son of one of the families who was actually, an NRI, and he had moved overseas. He gifted his shares to his mother. Someone advised him that there would be some tax advantage or benefit, so he gifted. There was actually, it was a few years ago when there was whole scare of estate duty, and there was some trust structuring being done. So for some reason, he thought that it's better I gift it to my mother. Mother will be trustee, everything will be done. Within a week's time, we realized that estate duty is not happening anytime soon, and they wanted to re-transfer from mother to son. It was about a few $1 million was the value of the shares. So the client wanted to go back to RBI and say that now we want to cancel this transaction of gift. We want to return the share to the NRI. Problem was, RBI said, no, sorry, up to $50,000 is the limit. So while the initial transaction was doable, and we do appreciate that it was recently done, it can't reverse the transaction, because above $50,000, we will not allow an approval. So even though approval is possible, there is a limit that's applicable. So we will not allow an approval to, let you transfer the shares back to your son. Now, I think those were some of these concepts that I thought I'll pick up, and, some basic general concepts. And then we move into what are the options and what are the different routes that one can consider for, investing into an Indian company. And so we have the foreign direct investment route. We have the foreign portfolio investment route. And here there is some overlap if you are investing less than 10%, which I'll pick up separately. We have the usual foreign venture capital investment route, and then we have the NRI OCI. I do understand that there was a session yesterday which covered individuals specifically, so I'm not going to focus too much on the NRI OCI aspect. So we'll move into each of these. So what happens when you are investing under the FDI route? What are the specific things that one complies and what one needs to think of? And what is one of the prime challenges that I thought I'll bring out to you guys? One is that if you are issuing shares in a listed company, as I did mention sometime back also, there's a relook at the SEBI guidelines. So it also says that, if there are any specific transactions pursuant to which you're getting shares or selling shares, there is a relook to SEBI guidelines. So it could be issuance of shares where you look at the SEBI, ICDR, for example. If it is a purchase of shares, again, if it's on the market, you will be governed by the market price for that period, but you will look at averages again for pref allotment. And if it is part of any specific transaction like an open offer or otherwise or delisting offer, again, SEBI guidelines is what one looks at from a pricing perspective. The next one is purchase. So as I mentioned, again, it is as per SEBI guidelines or as per the relevant process prescribed under the SEBI offer transaction. So there's a specific reference to delisting regulations. And the next thing is that if a sale is being done, again, if it's a listed company, you will again have the same pricing. The only thing that I want to bring out here is that we should be very clear that if it's a non-resident person who is buying or selling, if you are purchasing, there's a minimum floor as a non-resident, or if you're being allotted, there's a minimum floor. If you are, on the other hand, selling, there is a cap. So there is what the regulator wants to ensure, that we don't let more foreign exchange go out, and we need at least bare minimum fair market value foreign exchange coming in when a foreigner is purchasing. Here, there is one issue that we always face in our deals and transactions that we do with listed companies, and which is why I thought of focusing a lot more on listed companies, is that you see relevant date is defined when you talk of pricing calculation, and relevant date really is defined to mean the date on which the actual transaction is undertaken. I put up the definition, but in reality, it means the day when your transaction is undertaken. And if your transaction is undertaken pursuant to any statutory approvals or otherwise, naturally you will get a delay. So let's take an example. Suppose I enter into an agreement in January and I need to obtain approval from the Competition Commission, or I need to obtain approval from the Reserve Bank or DPIIT, whatever reason, the sector, because of a sectoral restriction. So you have a time period involved. More classical case is that I'm buying shares in a listed company, and hence I have triggered the open offer requirement. And open offer, I must tell you that the period is anything between 60 to 90 days from the date of that agreement, from the date of the trigger. So therefore, if one has to do that, it takes 60 to 90 days. So if the agreement is in January, everything was going really well. So what will parties do? Parties will usually look at the price in the market. They will do the calculations and they will accordingly mention that as a negotiated price. It will be much higher than the market because usually the deals are at a premium. And assuming a non-resident is purchasing, it will have to be at a premium. If a non-resident is selling, it will have to be at a cap. So one would comply with the cap. Whatever maximum possible under the regulations, we mentioned that, So let's take a number, for example. Let's say the number was about 200 rupees was the value in January, was the fair market value. Non-resident says, no problem, I will take some hit. Let me sell it at, let me sell my shares to you and I will get 180 per share. 180, there's a buffer they kept of around 20 rupees per share. Obviously, we all know what happened on the March 19th. Lockdown was announced. A lot of other things happened. Cases grew. People got worried, and all the prices in the stock market were disturbed for a long period of time. Starting of March itself, not 19th March. It just be even before that when there was a sense of what is going to happen. Now, pricing so far as listed companies is concerned is based on the averages of market prices over the last few weeks. So there's a look back period. The usual look back period is about 26 weeks and 2 weeks. So dangerous one is the 2-week look back, and even 26-week is a weighted average. So it's a dangerous one because there's the impact of March, impact of February, and all that impact will come because my open offer completes in July, for example, because it takes me Feb, March, April, May to complete, and July or June, let's say June, my open offer completes. So January agreement, market price calculation of average of 26 2 weeks was 200. A non-resident agrees to buy at 180, sell at 180. So he was taking a hit of 20. Today, because of all these things that happen over the next 3-4 months, when the date of transfer comes, which is the actual relevant date, the price comes to say 150. Now, the non-resident had already taken a hit of 20 when he initially agreed to sell. Because the relevant date definition is the date of sale and purchase, and it is not the date of agreement, there's a big problem because now you have to tell the non-resident, listen, I cannot pay you more than 150. So this impacts a lot of transactions. Transactions don't go through, they have to wait, they have to defer, and because it's an open offer involved, it could also mean another open offer. Because now if the non-resident does not purchase the shares, he may also need to, and if he does it after 6 months, then he may need to launch another open offer. So this is a representation we've made and we've always been discussing with RBI. In fact, in most cases, we go for a prior approval to get a waiver from this because we've seen 2 or 3 recent deals where we have faced this problem, and luckily we had some sort of confirmation from RBI in place. I've also seen a scenario where RBI has refused to give confirmations because they also are quite, perplexed on this issue in terms of how to deal with it, because this is a policy issue. Relevant date should be the date of sale purchase or the date of agreement in case the delay is because of an actual regulatory approval or because of some, mandatory requirements. That's what we've been requesting. But I thought I'll highlight this issue because one should be ready to deal with this issue, especially in these challenging times when price can be impacted. Though market price is always fluctuating and one cannot predict what will really be the market movement. Now, unlisted companies, it's a simple one. The issue is that, your price is always linked to the valuation methodology and it has to be an acceptable pricing methodology. So far as issue is concerned, it's the same again. Purchase also, it's the same again. Sale, again, we have the same policy method. The only guiding principle that one needs to keep thinking of that if you are giving any exit provisions in your agreement when the investments are being done, you have to be very clear that you're not giving any fixed IRRs or fixed return promises, because it's very clear that the exit has to be at the prevailing price. So at whatever may be the invested price, we just had a call yesterday. Someone invested at a 16 million entry point, and today the value of the instrument is 7 million. The investor wanted to get 23 million because that was the agreement with the investor, that I want at least a upside of 6 or 7 million to my investment. But because the market value, fair market value is around 7 million, it is impossible to give that upside to the investor. The issue really being that, can I go to RBI and seek an approval to give that upside? Will RBI consider this approval application? Answer to that is no. I don't want to name a few clients, but some very, very large and prominent cases we have represented, it's very clear. RBI is not going to give you any sort of carve out from pricing. They do have relaxations which they make for distressed company and which they made recently, but those are at a policy level. No one-off, relaxation from pricing guidelines are available. The other issue, which I thought from a foreign direct investment perspective, which may be relevant and of interest to some of us, is this deferred consideration and how this really works, and whether this deferred consideration by itself is, what does it really mean? Does it mean that I can defer only certain amount of payable? Does it also capture indemnity? What is the period? Can we get extension? Can we not get extension? So I think deferral is permitted up to 25% of your actual consideration that you have to pay as basis the value. And it's also deferral can be done up to 18 months. And It can be for escrow, it can be for indemnity, etc. Now there are a few questions around it, and I thought I will quickly pick up a very basic issue of how we've dealt with this. One is that if we are looking at a scenario where we have a transaction where we want to withhold certain amount, not really as a deferment, but as a protective sort of withholding for the purposes of, some performance related conditionalities or otherwise. The issue being that, it is doable, but you have to honor 25%, you have to honor 18 months. Whether RBI gives extension or no, we've heard AD banks saying yes, they do, but we've seen challenges as well because RBI says 18 months by itself is a large timeline that they've allowed. Again, what about reporting? Reporting only is to be done at the initial stage when the actual allotment and transfer of shares is done, and not at multiple stages. What about a scenario where you have a reverse deferral situation where you are purchasing shares from a non-resident and you're deferring payment? This is one thought I want to leave you all with, and when we do questions and Q&A in the next 10 or 15 minutes, I think we can pick that up. The other thing linked to foreign direct investment is downstream investment. So while we can invest directly into an Indian company, whether listed or unlisted, we can also have an indirect situation of investment, which when we link to ownership. So the link is whether the entity is owned and controlled by an Indian resident or no is the main question. So whether that entity is owned or controlled by an Indian resident or no is the main issue. Both ownership and control should be with Indian resident. If either of them is not there, then it becomes a foreign owned and controlled company, or it is no longer qualifying as an Indian owned and controlled company, and therefore anything that you do or any investment that you make, it becomes a foreign direct investment in a downstream manner into the Indian company. So even if we have an Indian subsidiary of a foreign investor investing into an Indian company, all the sectoral pricing and other conditionalities will continue to be applicable. Now, there are questions around this, that what are the conditions that we need to comply, whether it is just pricing and reporting and sector conditionalities, or whether it is all these conditions. And the second aspect is, what about the fact that suppose I was investing in debt instruments through a subsidiary. So if I'm a foreign investor and I have a wholly owned subsidiary in India, which invests downstream into another Indian company, clearly it is a downstream investment because of what we just discussed. Also, it is going to be subject to sectoral conditions. So it has to only limit its FDI limit as per the sector conditionalities, comply with sector conditionalities of relevant sectors, plus it needs to respect the pricing guidelines, reporting, etc. But what about deferment? Whether deferment is possible, not possible. What about I deciding to invest into a optionally convertible instrument as an Indian subsidiary of a foreign investor? Whether that will be an issue or no issue. So this issue we discussed very clearly, and we've also had a discussion with the Reserve Bank on this, is that, see, for all purposes, except for FDI, the entity that is investing is an Indian company. So while for FDI calculation, sector and pricing, etc., we do treat it as non-resident owned and controlled, and therefore we calculate it as FDI indirectly coming into India. For investment in debt, deferment, etc., it is always an Indian company. So all that should not be a problem. We should realize that this is only for pricing, attendant conditions, sectoral conditions, and entry route. Anything else that you do will continue to be that an a loan or whatever it is from an Indian company. So you don't lose your character as an Indian company for any other purposes except for the downstream foreign direct investment. I think it's a good time, maybe before we move ahead, to take a few questions if you are fine, because I think then we move to the different investment sector, sort of modes, and eventually to the recent amendments. So how would it be like? Would you be posting? Can someone read out the questions, or
Yeah.
yeah? Okay.
Moinji, I would be reading out the questions. There are a
Sure.
few questions in the Google form which have come. I'll just
Okay.
put one after other.
No
One
problem.
of the question is asked by Akshita Puli. She's
Okay.
asking, is issue of optionally convertible debentures falls under FDI? As per definition of equity shares in NDI rules, equity instruments can contain an optional clause subject to a minimum lock-in period of 1 year.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's a very, very good question. And yes, I do agree that towards the end of the definition, it does say that you can have an optionality attached. And what I'll also clarify what that means. That means, and that is linked to a circular that we used to, which came through a few years ago, perhaps in 2014, if I'm not wrong. Both SEBI and RBI allowed optionality to be there, which means you can have a put and call option on an equity instrument in India. So long as you have a 12-month lock-in restriction applicable and a 12-month period applicable to such optionality. What it does not mean is that it does not mean that you can issue an optionally convertible instrument. What you can issue is an equity share, and you can have an attached call or put option to it. So the optionality is at the option of the investor and not to the instrument. The instrument clearly has to be fully convertible. So while you can have the call, put option, etc., depending on whether it's a listed or unlisted company and subject to certain holding restrictions, we should not read that to mean that the instrument can be optionally convertible or a non-convertible. The instrument will still have to be fully and compulsorily convertible.
Okay, I think that adequately answers the question. There's another question from Ravi, who's also one of the panelists today, Ravi Ladia. He is asking that many startups are faced with the dilemma wherein they need to establish the holding company outside India for better fundraise. However, once promoter sends even a single dollar outside India and then the holding company gives foreign direct investment in India, RBI treats it as round tripping. How does one overcome this, and how did the bigger companies like Flipkart and Uber Ola achieve this objective?
So I think I have actually covered a few slides on this. So if you don't mind, I would like to answer this question specifically at the time, because I've captured 2 or 3 slides on this very specific issue. And I'd like to share background and answer this question. If Ravi is fine, I could defer it to then. I hope it's okay, Ravi, with that. And thank you so much. And the 3 names you mentioned are clients. So I will still tell you the perspective and how one should handle, but I may not be able to tell you how they have handled it. But we will discuss the options around that. Please, you can tell me the next question.
Yeah. So we move on to the next question. And this is by Abhiroop Agarwal. He's otherwise known as Question Champ by Deepak Ji. So he's asking this question. So this is his first question in the session.
I say so because I used to be like him around 20 years back.
Sure,
lovely,
Deepak Ji.
Yeah.
So Abhiroop is asking for right shares renounced by resident to non-resident. The FDI made non-resident shall remain non-repatriable in nature, right? Still an issue if subscribed at discounted rate.
Can you just repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah, he says for right shares renounced by resident to non-resident, the FDI made non-resident shall remain non-repatriable in nature. Is there still an issue if subscribed at discounted rate? So I think what he's asking, if it is non-repatriable. So
no, I think, So I think I'm just thinking, because see, if you suppose an NRI, for example, because non-repatriable would work in the case of an NRI largely. And Abhiru, please add a follow-up question and we'll pick it up again towards the end if I don't answer this fully. My understanding is that whenever you use a non-repatriable route of investment, then you are treated at par with the residents. And if you are treated at par, yes, please.
I can even allow Abhiroop to ask this question directly from you, if you are comfortable with it.
No, I'm comfortable. Let me try to attempt to answer it, and then he can add for sure. My view is that if one is using his fund, Indian money, and hence his investment is going to be treated as non-repatriable. He is treated at par with non-resident investor. And suppose therefore an NRI uses his NRO account and you takes renunciation and debits the NRO account for that particular payment, then to that extent it is treated as as a resident investor for the purposes of that transaction, and hence should not be subject to any such additional pricing requirement, and will also be able to take advantage of the discounted price that is offered to all shareholders. Abhirup, if I haven't answered it fully, you can please feel free to raise your hand, and you can unmute him and we can discuss, no problem.
Deepakji, I don't see raise of hand by Abhirup. So should I assume
You want to
that
unmute? You can. We can ask him if it's fully covered. No problem.
Deepak and Ravi, I would need some help from you on this. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, Abhirup,
Yes.
you may raise your question, Abhirup, directly.
Yes, sir. Very good evening, sir. Very good evening. Sir, the issue
good
was
evening.
that speaker
Yeah.
yesterday had told us that the moment the right shares are being renounced by a normal resident to a non-resident, then in
Right.
that case, it will be considered that the shares acquired by the non-resident are in the same capacity as that of as a normal resident. Then in such a case, the nature of remittance from outside India shall remain in the nature of non-repatriability. So if that is the case, then how come if the shares are being issued at a discounted price, there's an issue for the RBI?
Now you see, I think this is a separate aspect. I feel that issue for RBI is only from the perspective of people taking advantage of this whole mode of lower price being offered for rights shares. So far as the status of the shares being non-repat, I haven't quite got that very clearly. I mean, I'm happy to discuss it separately, because in my view, necessarily if you are acquiring shares as a renouncee from a resident, I don't think the status would be the same. I'm sure there were attendant conditions to it. Suppose if it's an NRI who has non-repat shares, then the problem is that transferring to an NR usually would convert that nature, because how would non-repatriable conditionality work in the context of non-resident investors? But it's an interesting question. Yeah, interesting question. My view is that if you are getting anything on non-repatriable basis, I think it's a very good question. You should be treated as par with a resident, and therefore you should be able to take all advantage of discounts. But we can discuss it separately, why this would have been a problem really.
And Abhirup, I will share email ID of Moin separately with you.
Sure, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Moinji, I think we can proceed further with the presentation and we'll take the remaining questions in the end. Yes.
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
The next one I think I thought of talking about is about portfolio investors. Now, portfolio investors is another altogether separate route that's available for investment into India. The idea of this route is that it enables you as a foreign investor to invest at the stock exchange. There are limits prescribed both at the level of investment at entity level and at the larger bucket of an FPI investor level. So initial per investor limit is set at 10%, which is also a group level limit. And as a group, FPIs can invest up to a certain percentage, which usually is 24%. But there has been a unusual development which has led to that getting readjusted. And I'd want to, therefore, I've specifically mentioned this. And that is the fact that from first, when the NDI rules came into being in October 2019, what was mentioned is that if a board of a company wants to reduce the FPI holding below the sectoral cap, they should pass a certain resolution and reset the limit. If they do not reset the limit, on 1st April, the aggregate FPI limit in every company will become the actual sectoral cap prescribed under the law. So a lot of companies which had 100% sectoral cap got automatically adjusted in their limits to 100%. The problem that is going to happen and could potentially happen is that what about entities which have downstream businesses, which are sectors which are highly regulated and having multiple conditionalities? So what about those sectors? So how does it, so we know a lot of large conglomerates or large listed companies which have many such subsidiaries which are in defense, which may be in multi-brand retail, which may be in so many other businesses which have restrictions and conditionalities attached. So they consciously keep it at 49%. So I'm dealing at least with 6 or 7 situations where a company had already passed a resolution blocking FPI limit to 49 max, because you were always allowed, even in the earlier regime, to increase it from 24 to the sectoral cap. So they had all kept it at 49 so that they never have a scenario where they are foreign owned and controlled because of the FPIs. For other aspects, they can consciously control it. The only issue was that was passed, suppose in September, August, or July under the FEMA 20. Now, after FEMA, when it was passed under FEMA 20, they actually assumed that they don't need to go back to the shareholders, go back to the board and again pass, just because there has been some amendment in October. And then the lockdown came over and a lot of them didn't do anything. So because of this reset, they're quite worried, and we made representation that this reset should not impact a company which has already reset its limit under the past regulations, and it is and that should actually be respected, because that was a decision of the shareholders and the board. Another aspect that has come about is this problem of 10%. The NDI rules defines portfolio investment, for example, a foreign portfolio investment, any investment below 10%. Now, the problem is that a lot of foreign direct investors like to test waters in a company, and they initially try to invest up to 8-9%, see how things are, and then they start slowly increasing their shareholding. The struggle that we are having is that if you are investing less than 10%, the AD banks, some of them are taking a position that therefore it is portfolio investment and you should come through an FPI entity. Not a problem. Some have even gone to the extent of trying to register an FPI entity, but then what happens next? Your intention is to get substantial control. So eventually you will buy additional shares. And when you buy additional shares, you will have to get reclassified. So I think some banks have understood this, that, the idea of the Reserve Bank and government was to allow easy investment up to 10% without the rigors of all FDI compliances. But what was not done, or what is still missing, is the separate regime for reporting, because if you don't report it, then how does it get captured? And that is why AD Bank started taking a position that only FPIs can use that mode. But what is being done is that even if we've discussed with the regulators as well, and even otherwise discussed, but there's no intention to stop foreign direct investment below 10%. But the idea is that one should still report it as an FCTRS or FCGPR or whatever the case may be on the firm's platform, because one may, but the AD Bank should be clearly accepting that position. And that is one challenge that has been really going about. So far as an FPI crossing thresholds, there is a clear prescribed mechanism now on what you can do and how you can really bring back, or how you can get categorized. But one thing is clear: once you become an FPI because of crossing the threshold, then you cannot go back to FDI. If you become an FDI, then you cannot go back, really. The next regime, not used very frequently, but thought very quickly to touch upon it, because we've seen some situations recently around legacy investments, is the foreign venture capital investor option. This again by itself is a separate option, which is free of the troubles of pricing, etc., and is really being provided to give a boost to certain sectors, which is biotechnology and IT, and these sectors, as you can see, which would be an advantage for our, from our infrastructure perspective or growth, research, development perspective. There is a separate mode of reporting which is done by the custodian. However, recently, and this has led to some amount of confusion, the FCTRS requirement has also come about for these kind of, investments exits, really. And the issue being that, this has come about a couple of years in the amendments. But earlier, you see, when you invested as an FVCI, you didn't do initial reporting. Now, when this has come about, the problem is that when you file the FCTRS today, the bank looks for the initial reporting, and the initial reporting is not available in the system. And because initial reporting is not available in the system, they go back and keep asking questions, and eventually you have to get a confirmation from the custodian. And we struggled with few clients, because monies were not getting remitted. Another unique part of FVCI is that FVCI has an Indian account in India. They receive the money in the Indian account, and then the money goes out of the account after the 15 CACB formalities are completed. So you see, this has been a struggle for some of them, and which is why I thought it will be a good idea to share the insight and the learning that we've recently had. That when you go to file this FTCRS, you will always face a challenge because you would have not done an initial reporting because it was not needed. And then the only solution is to get your custodian to write and confirm what was done. So at least your remittance will get, facilitated immediately. And if one does not do all of this in the beginning, then they will have a delay and have a separate compounding for no reason really, because this struggle will happen. We've seen it in multiple cases where legacy investments were done under this route. Now, this is the issue why I intentionally covered overseas direct investment, and to consider Ravi's specific point on what about FDI ODI transactions, as RBI likes to call it, and I'll share I'll take a few minutes and share our thinking and some insights around this as well. And I'll try to time it well so that we can keep the last 30 minutes for questions also. So we all know that for overseas direct investments is something that is governed by a separate set of regulations. It also is subject to specified conditionalities. It also is subject to specified conditionalities. And we all know that there is a limit on net worth, etc. And I'll not spend too much time on to, what the issue is, but there is a net worth limit. There are some sector conditionalities on what investments you can do. The whole idea is that you can invest abroad so long as it's for bona fide purpose. It's within the 400% of your net worth, and it is you're eligible otherwise, and you're not subject to any investigation or any sort of enforcement action or anything which makes your investments under the approval route. Now, what has happened is right from around 2000, I would say 2014-15, we've seen cases where RBI, there was a slight amendment on how you file your annual performance review report. And as part of your annual performance review report, what RBI required people to do is disclose their step-down subsidiaries. And when they disclosed their step-down subsidiaries, what came to light is that some of these RBI entities, some of these overseas entities had subsidiaries in India. And RBI started questioning those structures, saying that how could you have invested into India through your overseas entities? Now here, interestingly, JV is defined as any overseas direct investment. So even a single share that you buy abroad in a company overseas by itself makes it your joint venture. And this is a, because it becomes your joint venture, yeah, you have to do your reporting, you have to make your disclosures, etc. And therefore, it's not a joint venture as you would understand. So any investment by itself becomes a joint venture. That's the first part. The second part is that now there is a permission under Regulation 13 to diversify and set up step-down subsidiaries. So if my business requires me to have step-down subsidiaries, I will set it up. I will have to do it. For example, I had an IT company, a client who's an IT company. He has 13 subsidiaries around the world, including one in India. RBI still issued a show cause notice and questioned it. So how does one deal with this? So we actually also worked very extensively with the Reserve Bank, the government. There were committees they formed, and they had all the AD banks also involved. And a lot of us, and I'm sure some of you also, who would have been consulted by them. The thing is that they wanted to deal with this situation because it was becoming a problem. Because a lot of people, for business purposes, genuinely needed to have these structures, including a lot of startups who wanted to have control based in the US or otherwise, or Singapore otherwise, because they wanted they had ease in getting funds from investors, rounds of funds, etc. Everything was much more easier. and they were operating. Now, without getting into a lot of exotic structuring, what is the solution today? Because today there is a clear provision. There is an FAQ that came about in 2019, which said that if you are investing in any entity in India through your JV or WS, you have to come to RBI for an approval. So today the position is very clear, and as we speak, even during the lockdown, we've got 3 or 4 approvals from them. Today one has to go for an approval and and get that approval from them. They give it subject to certain conditions, and there are specific conditions on how one would handle the funding, how one will keep the money separately, how one will not intermingle the funds, how it will be for genuine bona fide business purposes, what is the advantage to India, all of those things they consider. What about existing structures? How does one deal with these structures, and what will one do? It is not, the answer may not be same for each of us, because some of them may have done it under LRS route, which will have their other complications. Because for a fact that while LRS allowed you to purchase shares in a company, in 2013, they came up and said that, you can have LRS as an individual for setting up JVWS. No, so LRS always allowed you to buy shares. But in 2010, the FAQ said that you cannot set up joint venture and wholly owned subsidiary abroad. Thereafter, in 2013, it says now you can set up, but you have to comply with all overseas direct investment regulations. And it also said in Schedule 5 that you will never have a step-down subsidiary of such entity that is set up under LRS or where an investor holds shares in an LRS. So one aspect is round tripping. The second aspect is the LRS. So if all of these get combined, one has to very sensitively see the specific facts, see what has to be cleaned up and how one has to approach the RBI. Because going just for a straight post facto approval may also not work. Because while round tripping is approved, approval for an exception from Schedule 5 for an individual controlled entity may not really, work. So this is on a case-to-case basis, one will need to see. Ravi, if you have any specific question, I'm happy to take it so far as overseas direct investment is concerned, because then I'm actually going to move to the recent revisions to the NDI rules. If you prefer, we can take it even after that, whatever you suggest.
No, my doubt is resolved, completely resolved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Thank you. Now, just the last part of our discussion, there have been some recent revisions to the non-debt instrument rules. And now the most recent change, maybe as late as last week, is the getting some powers back to RBI. What happened is that because of the NDI rules coming into force, RBI also got a little bit, I would say, sensitive about the whole thing. And while it was intended to shift to make it more efficient for all of us, so that the inconsistencies between the policy and the rules and notification goes away, it ended up becoming something contrary, where RBI started to say that, listen, I don't have the control. I will go back to the DPIIT for everything, and I will consult government for all approvals. So I can tell you the timeline for approvals from RBI expanded from 6 to 8 weeks into maybe 2 times, where we saw that they were going to the government. We had to talk to the government, we had to talk to the ministries, and it became very, very complex. Secondly, we discussed in the beginning of our discussion that master directions were no longer there because they're no longer valid, and people were relying on it, people were taking comfort from it, but all of that was not the right thing to do. So we were, everyone was missing the July, sort of notifications which would come on the 1st of July. And RBI said, I will not issue it because I don't have the power anymore. This seems to be a movement back to RBI to consider and administer and implement these rules that the government has brought about. And they have now once again gained their stature as a regulator as opposed to just a consultative body, which it became for a temporary period of time. And RBI therefore is in the process of issuing these master directions, as well as considering and will as well be able to also take approval applications subject to some sort of internal conditionalities and SOPs that they're creating for each of this situation. So that I hope is clear. The next one is the non-debt instrument rules, recent amendment on P-Note 3. Now, this P-Note 3 came about as an amendment to deal with opportunistic takeover and opportunistic buyout of Indian companies by Chinese investors. This was a very specific target, but we didn't say it so very clearly. And we said that anyone who has a border sharing with India, or any entity whose beneficial owner is sharing the border with India, will be permitted to invest into India only with a prior government approval. Here, you see the key aspects which became a big problem is that we all knew where the target was when they said someone shares the border with India. But what is the issue? What is this beneficial ownership threshold became a very big question of debate. Again, whether an entity who is exiting, will they require approval? They said, no problem. You will not require an approval. It is only at the stage of you bringing in the money, So after that, the press note was very quickly, within about a week's time, notified into rules, which was much unlike our FEMA 20 days, where it would be many consultations, arguments, some changes, and then it would come after a month, maybe sometimes. I thought not to focus too much, but to bring out the whole issue around this press note in a short slide. One was, what about beneficial ownership? Not clear today. Likely to come through. In fact, they have also come out with a circular for procurement. So anyone who's attempting to get a procurement contract, and supposedly they belong to China or any of these bordering countries, they have mentioned of this some restriction and registration requirement, but they have defined beneficial ownership there at a 25% threshold, and they've spoken about control and a lot of other things. But so far as that is concerned, they have actually there was a lot of hope in the industry that whether we can rely on that, and someone spoke to the government, and even we tried to connect. What the feedback we got is that, see, it's not going to be the same threshold. That is in a different context altogether. This is in the context of foreign investment, so this is completely different from that. So beneficial ownership today is functioning on how different AD banks are viewing it. Some are viewing it at 25%, taking a cue from the prevention of money laundering regulations, which prescribe this beneficial ownership for KYC requirement. Some are taking a cue from the significant beneficial owners rules of the Companies Act. What is the most interesting to me is how does this function in case of a pooled investment vehicle? So in case of a pooled investment vehicle, the initial view that I had was that if the SBO is a Chinese, so if one of the managers or the CEO or the fund manager is Chinese, then it is clearly a Chinese controlled beneficial ownership. But what we've recently done is, in addition to that, we've also started looking at the limited partners to see what the position really is. Because even as far as limited partners is concerned, we need to examine the test of 10 or 25 as the case may be. But all of this with a caveat that government may take a different view. The second aspect that came about was, what about Hong Kong and Taiwan? Hong Kong is part of China, so there was no question, though they have a dual, sort of mechanism of immigration and dual processes of law and systems of law, all of that being there, it is still part of China, so there was no question. Taiwan, for example, claims sovereignty. Taiwan's case seems to suggest that, they have, but from an India perspective, because we've tried to be politically correct with China, we've never accepted Taiwan as a sovereign nation by its own self. Rather, we have different tax treaties, different WTO agreements, etc. We've seen with Hong Kong for that matter, but not with Taiwan. So I think today Hong Kong, Taiwan are treated at par with China, no problem. FOCC, what happens? Same problem, because of what we discussed. When an FOCC invests, same approval requirements, same conditionality, same issues will apply. Minority passive investment does not matter, irrelevant, because whatever investment, even single investment, same problem will be in place. FPI, FPCI, AIFs, all these three are separate modes of investments. So if you are investing into an AIF as a Chinese, problem is the same. But if you are if an AIF is investing, or if the route is of FPCI route, or an FPI is a registered FPI is investing into an Indian company, today the regulations don't apply to, and the restrictions don't apply, because they are specific to the FDI or the foreign direct investment related provision. Indian leg of a global M&A, one will need to examine the beneficial ownership. And beneficial ownership, because it's unclear, one cannot say no approval needed. One will need to take a call, conscious call. My recommendation still is to take a written clarification, because until it's in writing, even an AD bank's view does not help you. Now, what happens in few of these scenarios, which could happen anytime? One is what about a rights or a bonus issue? So I'll pick up the key important ones. I feel rights issue, for example. Suppose I'm an existing shareholder and I want to, and then there's an opportunity to get additional shares. Obviously, I should be able to get the benefit of the same price because I'm not a renowned CEO or otherwise, but I'm an existing shareholder. But the problem lies in the fact that when you do a rights acquisition, you have to bring in additional foreign direct investment, and hence you cannot do it. In reality, we are refusing them the right because going to get a DPIIT approval will take 3 to 4 months, and rights issue will be finished even before that, even if it's not a fast track rights issue. Bonus issue, argument, lot of debate, but my view is still you need approval because in effect it is amplifying your FDI in the company. How it will work in the context of a company, how you will refuse, where you will hold the shares, all those challenges are yet to be dealt with. Convertible instruments, if you have already infused the entire money in the beginning of the date when you invested, I don't think there is any new FDI. If the shares get converted, it's only change in stature or change in nature of the investment. Contractual rights, suppose you enter into a contract, my view is approval should be sought before FDI. It's not needed at a contract stage because nobody gives you an open-ended approval. They need to relook at the political position. Suppose 1 year later, you may not need this approval. Or suppose 1 year later, you will totally be refused approval, irrespective of, it will not be an approval, it will be a prohibition. You never know what the state of things of affairs will be 1 year later. Transfer exit, no problem. Additional funds to FOCC, problem. Argument is, what if I don't get foreign direct investment? What if I use my accruals that I have earned out of my business in India? Is that going to be out? Answer is no. It's still a downstream investment. So it's still an FDI indirectly. Still problem will be there. How does one now work? How does the entity work? What is the solution available? The solution available is the external commercial borrowing route. Other solution is that you can pledge your Indian shares to an NBFC and seek funds for them in India. So I just want to share one of the learnings and one of the recent approvals we've got. See, the provisions for pledge by a foreigner in the NDI rule says that if you're pledging the shares of company A in favor of an NBFC, you can do that so long as you're doing this to seek financial support for company A, for the relevant company. That's how it puts it. We wanted to pledge company A shares, but get support for company B. And because it was not so clear, we approached the RBI. RBI was that time living in the mode of going to government. So they went to government. All said and done, everything clear, approval came through. So long as you're supporting an Indian company, not a problem, it's doable. But you need, so these are some modes. They could do pledge. They could do external commercial borrowing, all of those modes, because companies that are existing today and they're Chinese controlled may need some funding because of today's situation. And these could be some modes they would use for this. This I thought was one case study, and if someone would like to talk about it or someone would like to discuss, we could discuss. So we have a Hong Kong investor who intends to set up an Indian company. The Hong Kong investor is a wholly owned subsidiary of a China company. So will setting up of Indian company require an approval? I think this case study is too straightforward. So because it's all 100% owned, we don't need to get worried about beneficial ownership. So my view is, yes, it will be needed because you are, 100% owned and controlled. This one I'd like to hear if someone has any thoughts. So, here you have A, who is an Indian company having 15% stake in an Indian. A is a foreign company having 15% stake in an Indian company. Now, A is owned by investor from Singapore. Singapore investor holds 70, Chinese investor holds 30. A now wants to infuse additional money to India company because of the current COVID situation. There is a funding requirement. Does anyone have any thought whether an approval will be needed or not needed, given whatever we discussed from a press note 3 perspective, or generally whatever we discussed?
I think there are no answers. We can proceed ahead.
Okay, no problem. So I think the answer is yes, because the thing is that beneficial ownership is not defined at the Chinese level, and though there is no actual control in A, because 30% is controlled by Chinese investor, it's crossing both the 25 and 10% threshold, and hence it will be beneficially owned by the Chinese investor, and hence will be subject to the same set of restrictions as would be applicable. So I think that was the case study that I wanted to conclude really with. Now I think we can open the floor for any questions on all the topics that we've discussed, and we can, deal with specific questions on any of the discussion topics.
Okay. Thank you, Moinji, for the wonderful presentation. We have a few questions.
Sure.
I wouldn't be specific in the order in which you've taken the
No
slides.
problem.
I'll just start taking the questions.
Sure.
The first question is by Mr. Vijay Gupta. He's
Right.
asking that we received FDI under 100% approval route and ECB loans for manufacture of fruit juice plant. Due to COVID, we could not start the plant. Can we use these funds for importing the goods from a related foreign company and make sale in India? Is it allowed, or do we need to give any intimation to RBI?
This money was received as foreign direct investment, or?
It was received as an ECB for the purchase of a plant, a fruit juice plant.
Okay. I think because I would like to focus on what the topic today is.
Sure.
But really speaking, what is the business of the company? If this is a business, is the manufacturing of or processing of fruits, that is what you mentioned, right?
I think we can allow Vijay Gupta ji to ask question directly from you.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Okay, Vijay Gupta ji, I have allowed you to raise your question. You can ask.
Yes. Actually, we received FDI in the equity part. Apart that, we received ECB also from the parent company.
Right.
So, due to COVID, we could not start the project. So this ECB amount is lying idle now, and, and we want to import from our related party, which is in Malaysia, and make a domestic sale in India.
You see, and what do you want to import?
The same product, the fruit syrup.
And what is your activity in your object clause? I mean, for example, what would be the business activity of this entity?
It is both manufacturing, distribution, retailing, and trading and importing.
Okay. So your NIC code is manufacturing, for example?
Yes, correct. Okay. Because our plant could not start due to this COVID.
Moin, I will take up the question for ECB. You can answer for the FDI.
Right. Okay.
Gupta ji, when you apply for ECB, you have to give the end use confirmation where you want to use this fund. Even a small diversion is not possible. It has to be exactly for the purpose for which you have applied for. So if you want to change, you need to apply to RBI, apply for an amendment, and then you can use that money for the purpose what you are seeking for. Subject to the minimum average maturity, it may change because manufacturing has 1 or 3 year MAMP, but if it is for say trading activity or general working capital, it can increase to 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Have I answered your question in detail?
Yes. So simply you are saying that we need to make an application to the
application and also match the MAMP, minimum average maturity period.
Yes.
Because for a manufacturing it is separate, and for trading or working capital it is different maturity period.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Moin, you can take up the question for FDI if it is connected.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, there is one more change. Since we have a lot of time today, at least we have 40 minutes more. So what we have decided that we will allow all the questions being asked by the participants directly. So we will run through the questions which have been asked in our Google form. then we will allow the relevant participant to raise that question directly from you.
Oh, that is perfectly fine. I just want to answer, and thank you so much on the ECB part. I mean, from an FDI perspective, see if we can justify that this is because I'm just trying to think from an activity perspective, what will this become? If it's a general part of your business, and if this is just an ancillary transaction that you're doing now, and will not really become your primary activity, then to that extent, given this particular situation, you will not be subject to the end-use restriction because there is no end-use restriction on the FDI that you bought in. But one would need to see whether your activity otherwise does have this feature, and this is how you have also done in the past. And really what you will be doing is you will just be getting processed products, if I'm not wrong, and you will be reselling them or selling them to your clients. So usually your activity will be processing, manufacturing, doing yourself, but this one-off event will not really impact the usage that you are doing because of the current situation.
Okay.
Great.
And only other thing I want to ask you is that you must have got your ECB only after you had the initial investment of 25% or more, right? From that relevant investor?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So I think that's fine. Only one more thing, and thank you, Raviji, for reminding. There was one case study we had left out in the beginning. Before we move to the questions, if we don't mind, now that we are all interacting and we, speaking also, I can just go back to that rights issue case study and we can just quickly look at it once.
Please.
Before we move to all questions.
Please.
Yeah.
In the meantime, if anyone has any question, kindly go to the Google Sheet, ask your question, and then we will allow you to speak here also, if time permits.
Sure. So this was the case study. We've discussed a lot of, specific conditions that one needs to consider so far as renunciation pricing is concerned, so far as pricing guidelines is concerned. So really speaking, I thought, and also we spoke of press note 3. So if someone would like to at least discuss or mention, it will be very helpful. What is the thinking, or whether this renunciation can be done, not be done? So I'll just read out one. So we have X, who's a resident of India. He wants to renounce his shares in favor of a non-resident. Such non-resident happens to be a resident of China. So the question is, first of all, can I renounce in favor of a resident of China? Second is whether any pricing guidelines will apply to this scenario. And is there any approval that we will require?
So is this an open question?
It's an open question. Otherwise, I will give the question.
You see, the system we have is that we are not have allowed everyone to raise or speak.
Okay.
We have to allow one by one. So,
no problem.
Deepak ji, I think Abhiroop had a question similar to this. If we can allow him to speak on this. Sure, he had a question similar to this. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I have allowed him. Yes, Abhiroop, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, Abhiroop, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So my question was so what has happened in my case that in October 2019, the company was incorporated.
Right.
And the FDI was invited on 14th of January. The shares were allotted to the Chinese national.
Right.
But on 13th of January, the AD Bank had received the remittance, but the remittance was reflected in the bank statement only on the 16th of January. And it is important to note that the account was a normal account and not the escrow account. Now, when we had filed for the FCGPR, the case is still on hold with the RBI, and they are saying that this case is under the NDI regulations compounding, and the case is under processing, and they are awaiting restrictions from CO.
Okay.
So in this case, what should we do?
So far as your investment is concerned, you have completed, the investment got completed in January.
Correct, sir.
Only thing is that now there may be some objections at the end of the RBI, and hence, you are not, and hence they've not approved your filing. So the restriction for Chinese nationals, etc., all of that will not impact you at all,
Right.
because your FDI has come in and it has already been reflected and shares have been allotted. What
Right.
will only happen is that only so far as the taking on record is concerned, the comments, etc., will be considered, and they will. So what one needs to do proactively, reach out to the regional office, speak to them, see what is pending, or speak to your AD, see what is pending, provide it will be taken on record. If regional office says it's pending with CO, then someone can also reach out to the CO and check what the real issue is, resolve the issue, it will be taken on record. But none of the restrictions or problems that I spoke about Chinese investment would apply to an existing FDI that is also or already come through into the country.
Okay, sir. That's,
Yeah.
There's only
Thank
one more, just
Yeah.
add on this question.
I think,
yes, sir.
Abhirup, there are a lot of
Sure, sir. Sure.
participants in line. So if time permit, we will re-allow you to ask your second question.
Sure, sir. Definitely.
Okay, I think before that, then let me just answer these questions. And if anyone has follow-up questions, I will pick it up. In this case, yes, renunciation in favor of NR is allowed. Pricing guidelines will apply. But because it's a listed company, there'll be no real impact on the price. And the last one is, before the person can actually acquire shares pursuant to the renunciation right, they will have to obtain a prior approval because it is a resident of China and is subject to the specific restriction under PES Note 3 of 2020. Please, you can get me the next question, no problem.
Radhika, please.
Yeah, sure. So there is another question which is from Ravi, which says that can a wholly owned subsidiary of a foreign company issue convertible preference shares to a resident? Can the conversion be optional? Can the conversion value be linked to holding company value at a future date?
This is a wholly owned subsidiary of a foreign company?
Yes.
And they're going to issue optionally convertible instruments, right? So
Yes.
I'll just clarify. If a wholly owned subsidiary of a foreign company wants to issue compulsorily convertible, then all the FDI restrictions, all the FDI norms of pricing, attendant conditions, upfront pricing, all of that applies. However, if they are issuing optionally convertible instrument, that becomes a debt instrument and hence is not subject to the restriction under the, hence is not subject to any restriction under the current set of rules, and is a debt transaction between an Indian company and another Indian company. And therefore, they will not be subject to any restrictions on upfront pricing, or whether there is a linkage to the pricing or whether there's an optionality attached. So in simple one line, if the instrument has any equity color, then it is treated as downstream investment. If the instrument is of a debt nature, then they are looked at as an Indian company subscribing to instruments of a debt nature and will not be subject to any restriction or conditionality. So they're free to do what they like.
Okay.
Ravi, is that clear? Anything to follow up?
Yeah, just in case they are doing a compulsory convertible, just in case. So then what would be the restrictions?
Then you have to you fix the price upfront as per the pricing guidelines on the date of issuance, and you cannot have any sort of divergence or variation or linkage to holding company performance, etc.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So there is another participant, Mr. Mahesh. He, I think, has also been raising his hand for quite some time.
So let me allow him.
Okay, sure.
So Maheshji, I have allowed you. You can raise your question. Maheshji, you have to unmute your mic. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. So my query is a little simple.
Right.
The example that Mr. Moin was showing, 70% owned by Singapore entity, 30% by China, and the approval is say taken. Suppose this China part is not there. Okay, initially it was all owned by Singapore. Initially. Okay. And later on, after this investment, because we will allow it, because Singapore is not under that approval list, it will be allowed. After the investment was done in India, shares were issued. If a Chinese company acquires, say 50% or 30% shares in the Singapore investor company, then how will we deal with it? Is there any restriction on that?
Yes. So the restriction is both on direct and indirect investment. And even if there is an existing investment and you are coming in as a Chinese investor, the restriction will continue to subsist. So who will have to take care of it is A. Because A is the entity who's invested into India, who holds the Indian company shares. If anything goes wrong and approval is not taken, then A will be the one who will be looking at compounding and who will have to unwind or do whatever is required to regularize the transaction.
Okay, so Indian company is not responsible for this. They don't have to.
The Indian company is certainly responsible, but even the investor will be responsible because the thing is that when now Indian company can be totally responsible if it is a allotment of shares. When it is a investment or a secondary transaction, then the purchaser is largely responsible for the approval requirement.
Okay.
Yeah, because what you are saying is not a fresh infusion into IndiaCo. Yeah. It is actually an existing investor at whose level there is a change.
Correct.
The language is broad enough to include both direct and indirect. In fact, they specifically mentions indirect also.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So next in line is Mr. Siddharth Kohli.
Yes.
Yeah, Siddharth, I have allowed you. Can you speak up?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Kohli साहब कहाँ चले गए? Yeah, Siddharth, please.
I just had a question on ODI. Now that the RBI has come up with the guidelines for specific approval in the FAQs, should the gifting structure still be followed, the one that we used to follow before for getting money into the IndiaCo after externalizing the entity by way of a gifting structure, or should we avoid that and go for an RBI approval?
I would suggest that one should go for an RBI approval because clearly one is that, RBI approval is coming through. There are specific conditionalities and it just cleans the structure from a future, perspective where you have a straight holding structure as you like and your commercial transaction is entirely above the board. And I think the conditions also that they're imposing are fairly straightforward. I can tell you a few of them. They're all, sort of proprietary, but at least few of them very straightforward. One being that you've actually complied, you're undertaking to do all reporting, you're complying with all your limits, and you're actually going to use this money for bona fide purposes. In one of my recent case approval, which came yesterday, they've actually told me to retain the money in a separate account. So what my transaction was, I was investing into a Singapore company, and the Singapore company was to invest into a US company, and the US company will invest in India. So it was a 3-layer transaction. What they've said is that when you invest in Singapore, Singapore should keep Indian money in a separate account and only use for this investment and not use it for any other investment. So those are nothing that is so onerous that one needs to go into any exotic planning around it. One thing I want to share also, just to maybe add a little more value to what in your question and what Ravi's question was, one structure that used to be explored, which also shouldn't be tried anymore, is that investment used to be done at India level. Investment used to be done at the overseas company level. And because of this round-tripping restriction, there would be voting agreements in India. So you see, investments not done in India at all, but the foreign investor used to get voting rights in an Indian company. Now that can't be subject to foreign exchange regulations. The corporate law discussion and debates is something that one can separately have. But many such structures were being followed, but I don't think I advise anyone to do that anymore because this is a straightforward approach. Approval comes through. But one thing one needs to do is plan it very well and present it very well. So the last 6 or 7 that we've always planned it in a particular fashion, which has worked for them. I know someone in one of my other offices had a very rushed approach, and within a week's time, RBI came with a rejection also. So it's about planning and presenting. If it's of a matter of too much interest, then I can share more insight on how one should present the case. One thing I think is clear, they want to know is RBI wants to see the benefit that the India company is getting. RBI wants to see the bona fide requirement to have the structure in this fashion, because the first reaction they come with is, why don't you have a direct investment into the Indian company? Why do you have to invest into the overseas company and then come through the overseas structure? So that needs to really come out very clearly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was too helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Next in line is Mr. Aditya Surana. Aditya, you may raise your question. Aditya, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thanks. So my question was, lot of these, as you touched upon, lot of these startups have float their companies outside India in order to get higher investments and better investment prospects. Suppose an Indian company which floats as subsidiary, say in Singapore, and the Singapore company is getting some investment from outside overseas people. So Indian residents who are actually promoters of the Indian starters, if they want to get invested in that investment vehicle outside India, say in Singapore, through their bank account outside India, is it permissible? Because I've seen that happening, and even the Flipkart case which was reported in tax, I could see something like that.
Okay. I think without commenting necessarily on Flipkart, but if a person has foreign money abroad, which is earned as a part of what they have done as NRIs, because some of the promoters have foreign assets, or one of the family member has foreign assets, using money from your foreign asset account, which is not something India linked or not LRS linked, no problem at all. You can do whatever you like. You're not subject to the FEMA restriction. But the issue really comes up when you are actually investing money from LRS into the overseas entity which has a structure in India, because under LRS, you are not allowed to have a step down subsidiary. So that really does not work. If you have foreign money, no problem. But if you have invested money into an account under the LRS, because that's also one of the options, you can open a bank account and accumulate money abroad. If you have sent the money, you are first required to confirm and declare in your A2 that this will be used in compliance with the FEMA requirements, etc. And nowadays, a lot of AD banks also tell you that you will not use this to purchase any shares. HSBC at least does that. So that is not the best thing to do. One may argue that how will RBI know of what the account is being used for, but they have their own internal channels and very good reporting between regulators. And if a small alert comes even from the tax department, it becomes a very big issue from their perspective.
Okay. Even if that money outside India is earned when he was a resident, would that be possible?
If it is earned outside India when he was a resident in that very jurisdiction, then it is his foreign asset. He has kept it abroad. He can use it for whatever purpose he wants without any FEMA.
So when he was a resident in India and he earned money, say in Singapore, that time in the Singapore bank account, would it still be possible?
But how would he have earned that money? There by employment in Singapore?
No, by some services that he provided and a bank account that he had opened when he was a non-resident.
No. Then that has a primary problem. If you are providing any services as an Indian resident, you need to receive money in India through the normal banking channels.
Okay.
So that will not really work.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Priya.
Hi, Priya.
No, I just was curious and wanted to know the funding received by Reliance over the last 3-4 months. As to what kind of investment would you classify it as? Overseas, the funds coming from outside India into India? And how was, just a broad structure of how this funding really worked?
So I'll tell you, again, we've been somehow or the other involved in some of these transactions. But I can tell you that these are all private equity investments. Okay. And private equity investments usually can come under the foreign direct investment route. They come through pooled investment vehicles. And these pooled investment vehicles are, clearly bringing out the money into the country through the foreign direct investment route. You may have some. So that's really the route that has been used. On the specifics of the transactions, unfortunately, I cannot,
Specifics,
comment.
I'm not.
Was that clear?
Obviously, specifics we are not asking.
No, that was under the foreign direct investment route. Yeah.
Okay.
So these pooled investment vehicles have a limited partner. The limited partner gets funding from different, different investors, and which is one example I mentioned. Therefore, it is important when you are ascertaining who the beneficial owner is to also see who is the owner in the limited partner at the limited partner level.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, the next in line is Mr. Prashant.
Yes.
Okay, Prashant, even though you have not raised your question through Google form, I'm still allowing you to raise this question directly with Moin. Okay, you are allowed. Prashant,
Hello.
are you?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Prashant.
Yeah. So my query is, very often we as a banker come across, investment done by either an individual or maybe company, maybe 6-7 years back, $100 investments. And suddenly, the inward remittance we received, which is in millions of dollars, saying that either it is dividend paid or whatever, or the disinvestment. So, how to deal with such, exorbitant rise of money? So, unofficially, off the record also, we tried to reach RBI on this, and RBI also said we also don't have control on such because under fair value calculation, they give all the documents, supporting documents, everything. So it is very, as a banker, difficult to ascertain whether it is clean money that is coming in or it's a money laundering.
So what you're trying to say is that fair value, the premium is exorbitant. Is that what you're saying? Is the premium exorbitant or the profit exorbitant?
Prashant, are you there?
Yeah, 1 second. Hello.
Yeah, Prashant,
Hello.
I'm just to pick up clearly, where is the value high? Is it at the stage of investment or at the exit stage? Hello.
Yeah, I'm just trying to reconnect. Hello, are you?
Yeah, we can hear you. Prashant, we can hear you.
Yeah, so my question is, maybe it's a part of dividend or maybe disinvestment. In either ways, $100 investment cannot be in 6-7 years, $1 million or so, no? So,
and that is a overseas investment that is coming back, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, you see now, strictly speaking, some of these are founder shares, where because of your particular, we were just dealing with a situation where someone got shares for $800, and they have a promised exit of $10 million in 1 year's time. So these are founder shares which have other relationships in terms of, because of your, stature as your relevant experience, your ability to get some funding or something that you have, really known about this business or the dynamics of this business, that you get that kind of valuations. Now, no one can clearly say, and one always has the doubt that there could be possibility that, there is that there may be some other foul play at the overseas party's end, but so long as there is explainable justification, commercial contracts, proper payment, proper parties, clients, that really would work. And by itself, that may not be looked at as money laundering by RBI unless there is some other alert, because there is potential for certain businesses to grow. And sometimes you get these founder shares really cheap overseas because the pricing requirements that are prescribed in India are not applicable in all jurisdictions. Like, for example, I'll tell you, we've seen situations where in the US you get shares for free. And we've actually had a discussion with RBI once that we can regulate only when there is remittance of money. If someone gets shares for free as an individual, what will it be? Even if it is not in the nature of a cashless ESOP, because cashless ESOP is specifically covered. But what if it's not in the nature of a cashless ESOP, but it is received free of charge? So, those kind of questions are to be looked at, and to see whether that jurisdiction may give you shares at a low value because of your stature, your experience, etc. All of that put together, if explained, no problem. But if there could be a foul play at someone's end, and that could come to RBI's attention at a later date also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So next in line is Mr. Abhijit Kawade. Abhijit ji, you may ask your question, please.
Hello.
Yes.
Sir, can an overseas corporate body, which were prevalent in the erstwhile prior to FEMA, that acquired shares of an Indian company, and now they want to sell the shares to the NRI promoter of the listed Indian company. The Indian company is a listed entity, and the deal is going to happen through a block deal. So can this sort of a transaction be allowed, or is any prior RBI approval required for such case?
You see, overseas corporate bodies got derecognized sometime in 2003.
Yes.
And when they got derecognized, RBI had issued a derecognition circular and also prescribed the requirement for an approval as and when they are doing any transactions or they are, selling. Because what RBI did at their end, they created a blacklist of non-compliant entities. And as and when we approach them, they check whether they are in that list or not in the list. Assuming they're not in the list, RBI gives you an approval and the transaction can be done. My recollection, and I may be wrong also, is I feel that exit by OCBs on the stock exchange through a block will be possible subject to their prior approval of RBI being obtained, because even otherwise a non-resident is allowed to exit on the stock exchange. The problem really is to purchase on stock exchange, where you necessarily need to be either a portfolio investor or you need to be in control, and hence you can take an exemption and be able to purchase on the stock exchange as a controlling non-resident shareholder and a promoter. So your question, to answer specifically, assuming they get an RBI approval and they're not having any restrictions from RBI, they will clearly have no issues in selling the shares on the stock exchange to the existing NRI promoters. Another thing you need to be mindful of is the other thresholds that are prescribed, whether they were named as promoters, not named as promoters, and whether any exemption is necessary to be obtained, whether general or otherwise, from SEBI, because certain investments or transfers beyond 5% to an existing promoter can also trigger an open offer. I'm telling you this because we are dealing with an exactly similar situation for an OCB who wants to move the shares now to the existing promoters.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So next in line is Lakshmi Narayan Yara Yojana. So I am allowing Lakshmi ji. I think, right, just a sec.
Sir, you may allow Mr. Murthy.
Yeah, I have allowed Lakshmi Narayan ji also.
Yeah, good evening. See, I would like to understand the renunciation of right, whether a resident can renounce his right to non-resident.
Yes, resident can renounce shares to non-resident and renounce their right to non-resident. If it's a listed company, there's a platform on the stock exchange which allows trading of these rights for a certain minimal price. And only change that has come about is that if you are renouncing in favor of a non-resident, the pricing at which the non-resident purchase should be compliant with the pricing guidelines. So far as unlisted company is concerned, therefore, there'll be multiple prices because usually rights issue is at a discount. But so far as a listed company is concerned, there will be no real impact on the price. So it will be at the same price, even though it's part of a renunciation process.
So if that is the case, so as per that regulation, it talks about one condition has to be complied. The capital instrument to be acquired on renunciation rights shall be subject to same condition, including the restriction regard the repatriability. So correct. If a resident acquires shares, so there is no question of repatriability. So how this correct. Condition will be complied?
If a resident, I think you meant non-resident, is it?
No, or resident? See, I'm asking, it's a resident only. So the condition number 4 talks about repatriability.
Correct.
Okay. So correct. For a resident, there is no question of repatriability. So there we have a query.
No, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why that is mentioned. Sometimes non-resident Indian shareholders who move out of India, they have their legacy holdings, they live in India. And if the legacy holdings gets a rights issue accrued to it, then they are treated at par with residents for the purposes of this particular transaction. Also, some non-resident Indians use their NRO account for investing in India. And if they have used that NRO account for that particular investment, they are residents. And therefore, they have the repatriability restriction. And which was another question also today earlier, that how does that function? And that is why this condition exists, that the same repatriability conditions will be continuing. My only, so that's really, does that answer your question?
Yeah, this answers. We had a couple of different view from when we took up with Reserve Bank also.
Right.
So they were also, because each regional office had its own view. So
Yeah.
regional office Mumbai had it should be under approval route. So that's where this question being
and
raised.
I think that also links to the previous question.
Yeah,
that if someone is holding on a non-repatriation basis, right, and they want to transfer. Hello.
Yeah,
we can hear you, Moin.
Yeah. So someone is, they will actually, end up converting the status to repatriable. But if the money goes to the NRO account, that should not be a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Moin, if you allow, I have two more participants in a line. If you are not tired, we can
no problem.
Put them through. Okay, so next in line is Mr. Prabhakar. Prabhakar, you may ask your question.
Hello.
Yeah, Prabhakar, we can hear you.
Yeah. It's like this. One of my clients, which is a LLP registered in India, and is into manufacturing of agri-based products, and it's also indulging in exports. Okay, this for LLP is offered an investment opportunity by a Hong Kong origin person who is settled, who is holding citizenship in US. Okay, and he is also having his business in US, but his origin is Hong Kong. Okay, and he proposes to invest in the company with the LLP in India. Okay, now he wants the investment proposal, whether it should be in the form of capital investment or a loan investment, and the returns he wants to be repatriated. So how are we to give the approval for his proposal?
You see, LLPs by itself are not, it's not very clear how P-Note 3 will apply to LLPs. But if it comes in the comes in the form of loan, then it's more easy to justify. Because a Hong Kong national would otherwise be subject to the restriction under the press note.
Even if he holds UN citizenship and he is settled in US.
He was, what citizenship does he hold?
US.
Oh, if he's a US citizen, no problem.
Okay. So even Hong Kong origin it will not bar him.
But it's not, no, so that question is that he's the individual, right? His entity
individual.
Is Hong Kong,
yeah.
And where is the entity based?
Yeah, his entity is based in US, and my client is in India. LLP is in India, and it is Indian registered.
So then, where is the Hong Kong connection? I'm sorry, I'm not getting.
See, a person is of Hong Kong origin. The person who is holding UN citizenship, he is a Hong Kong origin person, like person of Indian origin, like that. He is also person of Hong Kong origin.
Question is simple. If he is not a citizen of Hong Kong today, then his trouble.
If he is holding dual citizenship, Hong Kong and US,
then his troubles continue because on a citizen.
Yeah.
If he is a citizen of Hong Kong, then problems continue. Therefore, the capital investment will be better because restriction is on FDI and foreign investment. So if a loan form of investment is done, that will be out of the purview of the restriction.
Okay, loan is preferred.
Loan is preferred according.
Okay, thank you so much.
There's a more on LLPs that I don't want to give you that aggressive view, but I am saying loan will be a better mode to do the deal.
They accept the funds.
Yeah.
And repatriation, the return on the loan.
That will
the interest to be repatriated.
That's right.
So can that be repatriated? The interest part on the loan.
On the loan, it will be possible, not a problem.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabhakar. So our last caller is Mr. Venkat Murthy. Mr. Venkat, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Please.
Good evening, sir.
Very good evening.
One company is having 25% FDI.
Right.
This incorporated with another foreign company, an Indian company. That foreign company holds 51%. This Indian company holds 49% in this resultant company. Now, this resultant company filing FCGPR.
Right.
is it a downstream investment and to be disclosed about this 25%?
Your entity who's an Indian company is controlled by foreigner because you mentioned 51%, right?
That is the second company incorporated. First company is 25% FDI. Second company is incorporated with this
25% FDI. Who controls the company? I mean,
Indians, 75% Indians. They control the company.
So I'll tell you, your company A, where there's 25%, that company is an Indian owned and controlled company.
Perfect, sir.
When it invests down, nothing to be done. But when this second company where 51 is now a foreigner invests downstream again, that's when the problems will start.
You mean to say that the subsidiary company where the foreign company holds 51% and the 49% by the Indian company where 25% is a foreign holding need not inform RBI in FCGPR about this downstream investment?
Because that company who's the Indian company where there is only 25% FDI is controlled and owned by an Indian party.
Perfect, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
So that was our last question.
Deepak ji, I would like to ask one question.
Sure, sir. You can ask 10 questions.
Moin, just want to know what is the practical timeline currently you are seeing for investment where press note 3 type of application are done? Have you received any application approval for any application?
So we've made, sir, we've made applications, but approvals have not yet been received. Okay. The timeline, I'll tell you what we are looking at, because there is a, Home Ministry clearance also, which is required as a precursor to the approval. That by itself takes about 2 months. Okay. And we are telling clients about 3 to 4 months. And but I must tell you that there is enough interest still in the market. And the very, very large Chinese players feel very aggressive, and they have a certain self belief that they will get approval. So even today, geopolitically, whatever has happened in Ladakh and otherwise, we don't see any reduction in interest from these investors. Another thing I must share, and thanks for raising this question, is that while this is a restriction for FDI, whether it is an NBFC registration, whether it is a PPI license registration, whether it is an FPCI new setup, or FPI new registration, everywhere they're asking you the beneficial owner question. And this question is making me nervous because I don't know how that will impact the discretion for getting registration, where things are pending.
Okay. In one seminar 2 days back, where in a panel discussion, RBI ex-retired officer was there.
Right.
Somebody asked him about ECB. What is your view on ECB from Chinese companies?
Right.
He said, technically, I agree that it is not covered, and the press note 3 is not covered. But if this is done in excess, RBI will stop that also. They are just trying to see in the market what's happening. So they said, caution to other people that don't misuse it, don't make it as a planning exercise. Right. If it is a normal situation, you do it, but don't do it in excess. That is what he suggested in the panel discussion.
Right. I think it's a very good input. Thank you for sharing this. I mean, because I think they would be also thinking what to do, and I'm hearing that they're struggling on how to block at FPI level also, because FPI by virtue of the option is so open-ended that anyone can register and then come and buy on the exchange without a lot of control.
Okay. Right. Thank you. I have done with my